Greetings, Internet people. Welcome to Knowledge and Resistance. So today, I want to talk about how all white people are racist. Now, before you go getting offended, we need to understand that not all of the racist attitudes and beliefs that we are indoctrinated with were a conscious choice. And I'm going to go over that and how that is. But when we think about, when we think about the term white supremacy, we tend to think about Nazi Germany, right? The extreme conditions that ensued under Nazi rule. While fascism is white supremacy, it's not the only way that white supremacy manifests. If we think about what white supremacy means at its core, I'm sure we can all agree that it means that the dominant functions of society were decided and established by white people for white people. Any society that's constructed and developed by the white way of doing things is white supremacist. So what do I mean by the white way? I mean the way in which people decided is the correct way of doing things. For example, it was white people who decided that education has to look like a teacher standing up in front of a classroom with students sitting uniformly in desks, listening to the teacher, and memorizing facts, right? It was white people who decided that prison and subsequently slavery was an appropriate response to crime. It was white people who decided that the police were an acceptable social institution. It was white people who decided that capitalism was going to be the best economic system for us to use as a society, right? So a white supremacist society is any society where the white way of doing things is not only the dominant way of doing things, but is also one that favors white people over everyone else. And this is where the idea of white privilege comes from. The circumstance of white privilege is a byproduct of the white people who arrange society to benefit them at the expense of others, mainly people with different skin color and different economic status. And oftentimes those two are one and the same. So with this understanding of context and this understanding of historical development, I think it's important to understand how a white supremacist society is maintained, like how it perpetuates itself. So in 1933, a man by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson published a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. In it, Woodson discusses how black people in the American school system are not being educated as much as they are being culturally indoctrinated. Essentially, he argues that black people are being Americanized. What I think we need to realize is that the miseducation of the Negro also resulted in the miseducation of white people. We are subjected, or were, still are, I guess, basically subjected to the same curriculum that black people were. So we, too, were also Americanized. You know, the curriculum that teaches black people to love the American way of doing things is the same curriculum that teaches white people to love the American way of doing things. And it's that same one that teaches us to believe that the American way of doing things is the quote unquote right way of doing things. And that the American way of doing things equals freedom, basically. So essentially, from birth, or at least a very young age, I mean, one could argue from birth, we are socialized and conditioned to be racist because a handful of rich, white, slave-owning, genocidal men decided that the society they wanted to create would sustain the lifestyle that they had become accustomed to. The lifestyle of stealing land, the lifestyle of mass murdering the people that land belonged to, enslaving people, and exploiting labor. This is precisely what makes America just as white supremacist as Nazi Germany. In fact, in Mein Kampf, which is Adolf Hitler's autobiography, he admits to using the American government's treatment of the natives as a blueprint for what he intended to do to Jewish people. And it is these sentiments that are the foundation for every popular belief and attitude that white people in America hold towards black people, native people, brown people, poor people, and anyone else who doesn't conform to the American way of doing things. And that's because racism doesn't just target skin color, it also targets culture. Any culture that is practiced and or developed by any people of color will inevitably deviate from the American way of doing things, because the American way of doing things was developed by white Europeans when they colonized this land, right? So as white people with a strong emotional investment in the American way of doing things, we have a tendency to degrade, chastise, alienate, and deride any other way of doing things that doesn't coincide with the quote-unquote American way. This strong emotional investment comes from years of indoctrination, conditioning towards the patriotism that allows American white supremacy to perpetuate itself. So, as a result, over time, we develop attitudes from which things like if he would have just complied or followed orders, the cop wouldn't have shot him. Things like hip-hop leads to violence. Things like if he would have just pulled his pants up and turned his music down, he wouldn't have been profiled by the cops. Things like use proper English or use proper grammar. All of these are racist beliefs that we tend to hold. But because they're not necessarily rooted in hate, we tend to overlook our own racism. Because they're not rooted in hate, most people who are racist have no idea that they're racist. But instead, these attitudes and these beliefs, they drive us to construct, counter movements. Things like Black Lives Matter, or things like All Lives Matter, things like Blue Lives Matter. These counter movements to Black Lives Matter. But we don't do it necessarily to deny the validity of Black lives. We do it because of our sensitivity to being excluded from the spotlight. You see, for centuries, society has been focused on appeasing and catering to white people, particularly white men. Let's just be honest here. We have been the center of attention, social attention, and praise for so long that the minute any movement gains international attention that isn't about stroking our egos, we throw adult temper tantrums. And that's basically what these counter movements are. Or I don't even know if you can call them movements. But we're so spoiled that if anything isn't about us, we have to go and make it about us. All of a sudden, kneeling during the national anthem to protest police murdering black people is disrespectful to soldiers. Soldiers who fight for American imperialism. Soldiers who fight for the American way, right? Hint, it was never about soldiers or the military or anything else. It was white people who went and made it about that. But we're so spoiled, and because we're so spoiled, we feel attacked. All of this feels like a personal attack on white people because our entire identity has been built on racism. It's been built on the degradation and subjugation of people with different skin colors and cultures in order to make ourselves feel worthy, feel valid. Racism is the foundation of white identity. So even if All Lives Matter wasn't a blatant attempt to tell black people stay in your place, which it is, it's still racist because it's an argument against black people's call for help, which is an attempt to shut black people up. What we as white people need to understand is that not all of our racist and attitudes and beliefs were a conscious decision. Some of them were planted in our subconscious long before we even knew what race was. However, although we may not be responsible for their development, we are responsible for changing them. We still have to separate ourselves from the emotional investment we have in the tenets that we live by. We have to make an objective analysis on the attitudes and beliefs that we hold. And then we have to change or eliminate any of them that are rooted in the subjugation or degradation of others or their cultures. It's not more noble to deny your racism than it is to acknowledge and fix it. Fixing your own racist beliefs is more anti-racist than trying to convince the world that you're not racist. And that's really what it comes down to. So this is part one of how all white people are racist. There will be more to follow because it is such a deep and complex subject, and it is so ingrained within our society that one video just wouldn't cover it. If you like what you heard, like what you saw, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Make sure to like it, share it, comment, all of that. And I'll see you next time.